to have today. So welcome everyone. This is Dr. Alana Jakes, and today is the first of what we hope will be several. Dr. Olnett has made a commitment to serve underrepresented student populations within the larger campuses. We're starting today with LGBTQ, and we will have other single days like this discussing the challenges and different aspects that come with our community of being a part of a special community. I'm joined today by Dr. Waldron and Dr. Moorhead, both of whom are deans at their respective universities and their graduate schools. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for being here. Side note is that this all got started because we were in a conference in San Diego and it was Pride. So we ditched out of the conference and went to hear Melissa Etheridge. And out of that, I was kind of reborn with the need to be able to do this kind of work too as part of my larger educational work. So thank you to everyone who is watching. Thank you to everyone who has come. If you, in your beginning, in your confirmation email, you were given a notice. You can go to wooclap.com, LGBT Open, and you can put in questions there that we will make sure we get answered today, and they will also go out and reside and be part of the emails back to people once the recording, because always we have about 15% of the people who come live, and the rest of our population comes by recording. So thank you for that. Thanks to everybody. Everybody's using the chat. We're off to a good start, and here we go. We thought that we had 3 questions, so I'm going to ask the deans to introduce themselves. Dr. Waldron gave me some slides, so she gets to go first.
Great, thank you.
And then for each one, then also, what is it like for members of LGBTQ community on your campuses? And what do you recommend just to the wider population of people who self-define as part of this population and yet live in different parts of the world? And as we know, context at the moment where you live is dramatically different, especially in other parts of the world. And I'll come back to some lessons I've learned about that recently at the end. So this will get us started. And once again, wooclap.com/LGBT Open. So, Dr. Waldron, up to you. You can talk.
All right. So I've kind of lost everybody.
Oh, we can still see you fine.
Okay, great. So I think for myself, thinking about my own academic circles, it's important to know the discipline that I come from, which is physical education kinesiology. And so I have both a master's degree and my PhD is in developmental kinesiology. And so within my discipline, it is very common, particularly with women, to identify as lesbian, as queer. And so within that, in some ways, I had social support embedded within my discipline. And I think that was important for me as I worked through my different degrees and started off as a junior faculty, that I had pretty good mentors throughout my whole process. And I do attribute that to my discipline that I found myself in. My graduate school mentors were 1 to 2 generations older than me. And that was important because I got to identify, or I got to understand sort of where their struggles were. And so my doctoral advisor actually was 2 generations older than me, maybe 2.5, and had a housemate and talked about these issues in a much different way, because for her, being a woman within the academy was quite an obstacle and quite a challenge that needed to occur. And so I think those pieces really shaped my identity and shaped how I operate within academia. I'm at the University of Northern Iowa, which is in the northeast corner of Iowa. I have been here, it was my first job after graduating with my PhD, and I have been here, I'm starting my 17th year. It's been an evolution, to say the least. And so I came out of my doctoral work in 2003, and I think the climate was just starting to shift a little bit at that time, that we started to see some movements, at least within the institutions that I was looking at, that we started to see some shifts, small shifts in terms of inclusivity, in terms of maybe openness to accepting individuals along the gender and sexuality spectrum. I would say that my position at UNI, it has been a constant evolution. Constant evolution. And so luckily, when I came to interview, again, because of my discipline, there were a couple of women who were not necessarily out, but were able to identify markers and would leave a couple of hints to me to say, they at least were open to kind of talk about what life would be like as a lesbian woman on campus if I wanted to. And so that I was very appreciative of that. My now wife was often called my housemate, my good friend. There'd be invitations that were sent to individuals and their opposite sex spouse, and they would only come to me. And so I have a number of stories and kind of evolutions over time that happened. For me, Northeast Iowa is not a hotbed of queer individuals. And so part of my adjustment was also trying to find community within Northeast Iowa, which continues to be a struggle. And so being able to balance kind of what I was doing at the university with trying to find a social support network outside was really, really challenging. My scholarship also focuses on gender and sexuality in sport, and I continue to be amazed that I have not had any pushback at my university for that. And so as I went through the tenure and promotion process, no one questioned what my scholarship consisted of. No one questioned the rigor of my scholarship. No one said, we don't want you to be here because of what you do. And as I've thought about that, that actually really surprises me. And so I think that what that speaks to is perhaps some of the other privileges that I hold. And I would just say that, being part of the LGBT queer community is really only one of my identities. And I carry a lot of privilege with me in other aspects. And so in some ways, I can kind of shift in and out of this identity in ways that I don't think all people can.
Would you like me to jump in here?
Yes, please.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I see that we have more people adding all the time. This is really exciting to me that we're able to offer this conversation. And I know that I speak for Dean Waldron and Dr. James in saying that we do not at all represent the voice of all LGBTQ people. I want to pick up on what Dr. Waldron just said. We are both actually quite similar in our backgrounds. As it turns out, I am one generation ahead of her, I would say, in terms of dating myself chronologically, but I do come from a fairly similar background. I was undergrad in phys ed or sports studies in Ireland. I grew up in Dublin and I moved to Belfast, which is a whole other conversation that we could talk about, but I came out back in the 1970s, which is probably ancient history for most of the people on here. And things were very different back then. I left Ireland to come to the US in the early 80s because as an out LGBTQ person at that time, I was going to be teaching in a system which was primarily run by religious orders, and that was challenging, let's just say. So I came to the States because I believed that here people respected people for who they are. And I think it's a little ironic for me now looking back that Ireland has come so far in its progress around LGBTQ issues, and there are parts of the United States that are significantly less LGBT friendly, I would argue, at this point in time. So that's a conversation that we can have. Going back to as well the point that Dr. Waldron was making, I want to say that we are obviously both white and educated, and that is not the norm. If you looked at LGBT lived experiences across the board, we want to make that clear. I am an immigrant and an out LGBT person, and I have just been hired as part of a national search as the Dean of the Graduate School at the University of New Hampshire. So I think that's also important to note. There's lots of positive news involved in that. A little surprisingly, as Dr. Waldron mentioned, my very out active persona was not really brought up much in the interview process, which is sort of the good news and perhaps the not so good news in a way, depends on your perspective, I guess. But for those of you, I think, was it Kevin who mentioned a little bit ago that he was about, or they were about to go on the job market? I think that you could really take some really good news out of that, both Dr. Waldron and I have been selected as deans of graduate schools, in my case, an R1 graduate school, while being out and an immigrant as well. And so I think that speaks volumes. When I went out on the job market initially after my master's degree, I did look to see which schools had the non-discrimination policy that I was looking for. In those days, it was the addition of sexual orientation. I would suggest if you're looking for LGBTQ friendly environments, that a place that you could still go is to look at the non-discrimination policies of the institutions or the organizations with which you'd like to be associated. And now I would obviously look for gender identity and as well as sexual orientation in those policies, but we can get into the details on that. I will say that being in an environment back in the 80s, I came to New Hampshire, it was not at all an LGBT friendly place. I would say it certainly wasn't hostile, but it wasn't somewhere that was very friendly necessarily. And so we have done a lot of hard work in networking and creating small groups of faculty and staff and students who could come together to create support for each other. And slowly but surely, we have picked away at policies on campus. We have created organizations and structures that would support us throughout. And again, I could get into more details, but things like safe zone programs that I began as a class project for my PhD back in 1993, if you can believe it. That's still going strong. We have an awards breakfast every year now where the awards are presented by the president of the institution. We worked hard to get all of the athletic department coaches to come so that those LGBT coaches who might not be able to be out could come as well if the football and the hockey coach were there. These were strategic positions we took, and those events now are part of the standing calendar at the institution. Doing things like that very symbolically provides space for us to exist, and it signals to the student body that this is a safe place for them and a place where they can be themselves. And slowly but surely that ball just keeps rolling, and it's basically creating a reality as it goes. So I'm very proud of that work, and I can certainly talk to you about those kinds of things. I think I'll leave it there for now.
I have to remember to unmute. Excellent. Thank you very much, both of you. And I think it's a good time to move on to this question of what's it like on your campuses? What would students expect? And ups and downs on that, please. And
Well,
Jennifer,
yep. So we have had a lot of progress in the last 5 years, and I would say probably even longer than that. Iowa, actually in 2009, Iowa allowed same-sex marriage. And so we had a Supreme Court decision. I say allow because that's how I feel about it, is that they allowed finally. And so we've seen a lot of changes, I think, within our whole state since that Supreme Court ruling. But really on campus, I think the biggest progress we've had is the last 5 years. We finally have a gender and sexuality services on campus. It has a director. For the last 5 to 7 years, we've had a rainbow reception. And so during the first week of the school year, the academic year, there's a huge reception that we have tabling by campus, on campus and off campus resources for our queer community on campus. We also have a lavender graduation, and so those both undergraduate and graduate students who are graduating, there's a special graduation event for them. Just this year, our Gender and Sexuality Services is trying to establish an employee group on campus, which is really exciting. It is long, long overdue. And that would include our graduate assistantships, which I think also is really exciting and talks about, in some ways, how we are trying to cultivate this, I guess, somewhat professional development or training or mentoring kind of throughout the progress of a career. We do have a proud, UNI Proud student group who is pretty active on campus. That primarily is undergraduate students, although there are some graduate students who kind of phase in and out of that. That said, I do think that campus life here is relatively isolating for a lot of our queer students. I say that because we have some support systems, but I don't think they cut across all of campus. And I don't think that there is as much emphasis kind of to put on this as needed. We do have a safe zone program that had remnants that started about 10 years ago and has been back up and running. But again, I'm not sure that that is sufficient in terms of creating a campus that we all want. I do think it's very program specific. And so I know that some places are much safer, other places are not. We have a Women and Gender Studies graduate program here on campus. And I know many students, because it's an interdisciplinary program, they take classes from other places, from other disciplines, and some of those experiences are not inclusive and are not as good as one would hope. And so I do think it is pretty fragmented on campus. People have to, they can reach out to Gender and Sexuality Services and UNI Proud, but beyond that, it's really upon the individual to find what they need in order to make life work. Dr. Moorhead, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. I would say that the reality is perhaps somewhat similar here. We have a long history of LGBTQ activism on the campus. In fact, last year, Ann Curry, who used to be the morning show host on one of the national TV programs, had a series on TV, and UNH's history was highlighted in episode 6, the coming out episode of a show called We'll Meet Again. So if anybody has access to, I think it might be on Netflix, but it was certainly on demand on our cable network here. The case back in 1972 or 3 was that the students wanted to create an LGBT group where they could get together and host dances, really radical. and it went to the Supreme Court of the state of New Hampshire and they won. And that then became case law that helped a lot of other student orgs get going. So we have that fine history to stand on still. I would say it's very crunchy here, and as they like to refer to it, it's very, I think people are seen as very sort of liberal leaning. And I think because we're in an LGBTQ friendly part of the world, there's less emphasis now on anywhere that's designated specifically as LGBT, because the theory is that everywhere is safe. The challenge with that can be, as you can imagine, that if you're not in the loop as to who the LGBTQ friendly folk are, then it's hard to sometimes find your niche and figure out how to connect. So I've been, again, pretty deliberate, for example, at the grad school in supporting students who wanted to create an LGBTQ organization. And I provide them with a little bit of support to get together and get some food and chat. And for a while they were doing a movie series and hosting talks and things like that. So depending on the semester and who's running it, they have different orientations. You probably know this, that a lot of times with LGBT organizations, there's the range of just being purely social or being very political, and then somewhere in between. So depending on the orientation at any given time of the leadership and the membership, those things can ebb and flow. So we have multiple orgs on the campus, and I think for people in different parts of the country, depending on how friendly the rest of the surrounding environments are, you might find it more helpful to find external communities versus on campus, or vice versa. It may be that the on-campus environment is really the safer and more friendly place to be, comparatively speaking, and finding out students or staff or faculty, or in our case, administrators, is often a good way to go. So I'm sure Dr. Waldron and I are sending out those little signals all the time, or maybe not so little signals. I come out during orientation, and every year I have students who come up to me and ask me how to get involved and how to connect. So it's a way that I deliberately make sure that students are comfortable. Even doing this, where we're putting this out on our information for doctoral and master's net, signals to our student body that I'm supportive of people, regardless of who they are. It's not just an LGBT thing. It's really important that we acknowledge all of people's identities. And I would say that we're a very white campus, and we are working very hard to ensure that our students, underrepresented students of color, feel very safe and comfortable on the campus as well. And I believe it's true that we have disproportionately a number of LGBTQ people of color on campus as a result, because we've got multiple identities often, and it's not a situation where you're one thing at one point and another thing at another point. We bring our whole selves to work or to school, and it's important that we acknowledge that. So that's something that I'm very conscious of, and I work very hard to work with the populations here so that people feel that they belong.
That brings up a question that came into us from WooClap that segues beautifully, so I'll bring it in here. This person writes, I feel comfortable, but as a TA, I feel that being completely out could be misconceived as flaunting or sexual harassment to some freshman students who may not have been exposed to the LGBTQ community before. Would the two of you just respond to that, please? Jennifer?
Sure. So this was always one of my probably greatest struggles teaching as a faculty member, was whether to explicitly come out in the classroom or not. And each semester I would make a different decision. And part of that has to do with who our student population is on our campus. So we are a regional comprehensive university. The majority, over 90% of our students, come from Iowa. Iowa is a very rural community. And so when we're talking about diverse identities, many of our students don't come with that experience. We are also a relatively Christian university, although we are public. We have 4 or 5 very active Christian student organizations on campus. And so those intersecting pieces always made me weary to come out explicitly in the classroom. I did some semesters, other semesters I decided not to. And so for me, it was always trying to pick up the signals within a particular environment. And so sometimes I would come out right at the beginning. Other times I may wait until I've established some trust within the classroom. So the students knew who I was, I knew who the students were. We had already kind of created this cohesive unit within the class. Other times it was just dropping hints along the way so that those students who were open to the hints would understand where my identity was. So for me, it was really reading the classroom. I will say that I always, as a faculty member, I always had a fear that I would be not as well respected, that my student evaluations would go down if I came out explicitly and made that a core identity within the classroom. And as we know, I have found academia to be one big game, and you have to abide more or less by the rules if you want to make it to the next stage of the game. And so I tended to be more of a game player and following those rules. And so it's not that I ever hid who I was, but I was always very cautious about the explicitness of coming out. Now that I've been here for so long, and I think particularly in this role, I don't have those fears anymore, as I say, and then I think about the times when I do have those fears. But I've been here long enough and I feel secure enough, and I've reached, the end of the game. I mean, there's not very many stages left in my game. And so I'm much less concerned about that piece of it.
Dr. Moorhead.
Yes, I really appreciate what Dr. Waldron's saying, and to jump off this idea of the game, I think because we're both trained in sports studies and kinesiology and have a mindset where we sort of see the world strategically using sports metaphors, that's something that resonates with me. But if you come from a very different background, I would want you not to perceive that as not being serious, because we're talking about strategically playing by the rules of the game. It's how I'm not speaking for Dr. Waldron, but I think it's a way in which we work within the world that's quite consistent with each other. Depending on your background, you might see things in terms of like biological life cycles or whatever it is that helps you to frame the world that you live in. But I think that the common theme here is that you have to do what makes sense for you in the moment, and that will not be static. I wrote my doctoral dissertation lots of years ago on integrity and how to live with integrity as an LGBTQ person, because sometimes coming out is the thing to do so that you can live wholly and fully and truthfully as yourself. And sometimes you need to not come out because you might not be safe. And how, when you think about integrity, you often think there's either black or white rules. This is right, that's wrong, we do the right thing. But the reality is that the right thing can be fluid. And so you have to make those decisions. Saddened to think that you are being very courageous in even thinking about withholding yourself from your students, because I think that that's wise, to be honest. Your gut's going to tell you whether or not you can come out at these times. And I would suggest that, if it's relevant, it's relevant. And if it isn't relevant, it's really potentially not at all. I think another way to do this is to say within your classroom, you don't come in wrapped in a rainbow, and you don't come in spouting LGBT political rhetoric, perhaps. But what you might say is to somebody, you might reference a partner, if that were to come up, or give examples where there's a case study that might have, it's like in any kind of way we're being diverse. We use examples using names that are not always John and Sally, who are very, arguably traditionally Western and white names. In the same way, you can integrate. So one of the ways, again, simple things like at orientation, I'll talk about the bathrooms. Like here's the men's room, and here's the women's room, and here's the gender neutral bathroom. And that's just a part of the day. That's just how things are at UNH. We have a very inclusive environment. And so we set these little tones all the time. So I think that's perhaps a middle ground where you don't make it about you as a TA, but you're creating an environment in which you're welcoming your students to bring themselves wholly and fully by making space for them.
I just want to comment about I was just at a global conference looking at the forces that are changing PhD education around the world, specifically research, and was disheartened to hear that people who were doing gender studies in Turkey were suddenly denied tenure recently in the last 18 months. So I think another portion of this has to be a wider awareness of the politics, and the politics ebb and flow on a big scale. And so to just have that as part of our awareness as well, not that it makes anything one day or another, but we do make our choices. And I always have said my partner and then she. That got it out there as much as whatever, and it avoided the equally when somebody says, well, he something. No, we don't want to go there. So we all have our own way, and we're all the age of we are. I'm probably a full generation older than, so you probably have 3 generations of academics here. So what do we recommend, given that it is contextual and it is individual and many of the other things we've already said? What else do we have to add to this one?
So, this took me a little bit to kind of think about what it is I would recommend, and how my path has unfolded in a way that I could be who I am. And so I think finding your comfort level is really important. And I say that because all of us have really different ways of being in the world, and ways that we're comfortable showing different aspects of who we are. And so I have a friend on campus who teaches in another department, and they have rainbow hair, and they are wearing markers all the time of their sexual identity. That's not who I am. I can never pull that off. And if I did, it would not work, because it wouldn't authentically be who I was. And so it's trying to find your comfort level based on who you are. I tend to be a little bit quieter, and so I'm not maybe at least at first as politically outspoken about those pieces, but they definitely come through in ways. And so it's finding kind of who you are and how you can work with that. Mentors are so unbelievably important. Like I said, I was so lucky and so thankful and so grateful that I've had amazing mentors who have helped me navigate some of the obstacles and struggles that I've had. What is funny is when the 3 of us met, one of the first things I said is, because I'm a relatively new dean, I said, who can help me navigate administration as a queer woman or a lesbian woman? I don't know anybody, I need them. And so finding the mentors as you move through and progress is really important. Finding support systems on and off campus. I could not exist in my career without having support systems off campus. And even though I said they're really hard to find here, they are here. And without them, I would not be able to be competent at work. I mean, I really need those pieces. I think monitoring both your physical and mental health throughout is really important. Unfortunately, we still know that there are physical harm that can happen based on our gender and sexual identities. And so being able to monitor that, as well as the mental health. We know that doctoral and master students on average tend to have poorer mental health than other individuals their age. Now you add this identity to that, it could be a recipe for really struggling with some aspects. So monitoring that and finding the assistance that you need. Asking questions And so, one of the threads that I've heard is that individuals who are safe, individuals who identify as queer may not be explicit. And so finding ways to ask the right question to garner a potential response that would say, okay, this is someone I can go to, and ask about experiences. And so one thing that I think is great about this panel is that we have experiences that we can share. They are not universal. They come from a very particular grouping of identities, but just the sharing of experiences, at least for me, makes me feel less alone and provides hope that it is possible. Whatever it is possible.
Can I just jump in there to say that there's a reciprocity between those of us who want to help and the students who need it. That if students need it and speak up for needing it, and especially in things like participating in Woo Clap, in writing emails and whatever, we can share that with the wider community when we go to conferences, when we go to LGBTQ things, and we can have more people, because clearly there's no man on this panel. We didn't know who to ask, or, so the more student interest there is, the more support there will come. There are other people and there are other things that can be offered. There will be a page for sure. This will be on it. There will be resources on it. We will pass that out to other administrators. They will add to it. This is a seed. We are planting a seed today that will allow a tree to grow, but students responding is what will make the tree grow. Carrie, your turn.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up from that. As we mentioned, we all connected up at a conference. And at that conference, I chair the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for a national organization to which we are all affiliated. And at one point, we had an opportunity for networking lunch. And rather than pick a topic, more traditional topic like financial aid and graduate students, or visa issues and enrollment, or whatever the kinds of things are that deans talk about. I won't bore you with all of those, but the three of us decided that we would have an LGBTQ networking lunch where we would be able to connect up with other deans, because quite frankly, it's hard to know who's who at these things. And we were really pleased that we had, I think, 10 or more people at the lunch, and several others who couldn't make it. And now we're going to the next conference in December, and we've now got a room for, we think it's going to hold maybe 30 people. Part of the point of telling you that is, as we hear from you, we can share amongst and between those deans the kinds of resources that you need. So we could go all the way from how to start a Safe Zones program to what kind of trans medical coverage do you have in your student health benefit plan. There's obviously different levels there, but we have a number of experts across the country that have policies and procedures and practices and examples of things that would be helpful on a variety of campuses. So our hope is that by hearing from you, we will be able to provide that wisdom that you bring to a broad group of graduate school deans, so that we can, in our small way, make graduate education a little bit more inclusive.
And I'll just jump in and say, if anybody has that kind of response they want to give us, if you put it in an email to me, and I'll type it in now, that's alana@doctoralnet.com. This is sort of my raison d'etre to be the spokesperson who can send information out to the wider, to be the kind of central hub. So feel free to tell us anything, and it will get passed on. And we're all very grateful to that feedback, because we do want to help, but it takes clues as to what kind of help is needed. We can't just make stuff up. So to that end, we've already answered the first question. These were other questions that came in, and there has been one more that will add to this. What do you think? Is it safe on most campuses? And when might it not be safe? What have you seen? Either one of you, jump in.
Well, Oh, go ahead. You can
Well,
start.
Okay, I think it's a really good question, and I don't know that there'll be it's going to be, it depends, I think is going to be the answer. I think, as Dr. Waldron mentioned earlier, there are pockets of support on probably all campuses. It's a matter of finding them. Some are more LGBTQ friendly or safe for people of color and other underrepresented minorities as well, immigrants like me. Across and amongst. So you may go, some of these are stereotypical remarks, so please forgive me for that. But I'd say if you were to go to women's studies or gender and sexuality studies or the multicultural student space on your campus, if there is such a thing, those are places where you're probably going to find support. And then from there, you can branch out so that they may be able to help you. We call that snowball sampling in research, where you could find somebody that's supportive, and then they can help find other people that are in your discipline or whatever.
Anything to add, Jennifer? Should we go on?
I just want, when might it not be safe? Again, I mean, there's very explicit times where I think we all, experience, whether it's derogatory remarks, whether it's other sorts of harassment. Our students do a lot of chalking on our sidewalks, and so sometimes we have incidents where our "You and I Proud" chalks, and then there are very derogatory, inappropriate comments next to it. And so, there's the very explicit times when it's not safe. There's also, I think, part of the reason I'm constantly observing my environment to know whether or not it's safe or not. And I think that's something that I have just kind of picked up living my life. But, if you have that sort of sense, I would follow it, because it's probably not safe for whatever reason. And so it is that explicit and also those sort of hidden messages that may help you make a decision.
I'm going to jump to the next one just because it goes with it. When you do come across somebody who is explicitly having a strong religious belief that makes you a sinner, or that any explicit comment comes directed at you, do you have any wisdoms to share?
So for me, I tend not to engage. That's just how I operate. I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, I don't have the resources to engage. For those situations, I'm probably not going to change someone's mind anyways. And so for me, it is really just a walking away, and then trying to find other mechanisms on campus to counter that message that I had. Again, the Gender and Sexuality Services, our employee group, some other places on campus where I can get together my support system and either just kind of share it and then let it go, or devise a plan moving forward. Like I said, we are a fairly Christian campus here. And so there are very strong religious beliefs. I have heard things, I have been told things. The chalkings, I mean, it is pretty, I shouldn't say constant, but it happens quite often. And again, I just choose not to engage because I just don't have the energy or the resources to do so.
I think it's a really challenging question, because we have to constantly decide which fight you want to get into. I think, you can rise above it all, but there are times when you feel like you just can't let certain things go, but you have to decide from your own physical and mental health standpoint how many of those challenges you can take on. I will say that when I was younger, I was always in the challenge. I was always up for the challenge. And then I maybe started to use my energy a little bit more wisely and didn't keep engaging, like Dr. Waldron said. But I will tell you that, I come from what's sometimes referred to as Holy Catholic Ireland. I was raised by nuns, basically, in my educational system. And as a Christian, as a Catholic who considers myself to be Christian in my orientation, I would argue that the Jesus that I learned about was the kind of person who would have encouraged us all to live happily together and to treat each other with dignity and respect. So that's sort of where I start with all of that. We have a strong religious tradition on this campus, religious traditions, and we do have some very well-respected Christian leaders who work with our student body, and they are well-versed in biblical traditions and can also speak to what was and what was not actually said in the Bible. And that has been helpful, so that they're straight white allies, basically, who then take that on and say, well, actually, this is what the Bible tells us about a variety of things. And that's work that's really helpful, so that people like myself and Dr. Waldron and Dr. James then don't have to carry that. I am certainly no biblical scholar, but I do appreciate when they come, for example, to the LGBTQ awards ceremony, and we always have a religious leader who does the salutation at the start of the event, signaling that, in fact, you can be both religious or spiritual and proud of your identities all at the same time.
The new question that has come in is, are there any particular schools or countries which include the concept of sexual identity, gender, LGBTQ, etc., in the school curriculum? And I think this person is looking at the fact that if we educate younger, that we can minimize stigma. Do we know of parts of the world, or do we have examples of that?
I'm thinking back on some of my research that I did, and I know Massachusetts, for example, was one of the states that very early on had done some work. We know from the research that our LGBT youth are at higher risk for a variety of self-harming kinds of behaviors, and so that the school systems in several states have worked hard to ensure that they put information into the curriculum to support our students. There's a group called GLISTEN, and I will get this information to Dr. James. And GLISTEN and the Human Rights Campaign and a variety of different organizations, such as Out on Campus, do provide us with experiences that tell us where people, where things are a little bit more progressive, for want of a better word, in this regard. So we will take that question as something that we would provide you with some more information. So thank you for that question.
Jennifer, any answers? Any other?
I have nothing, and I don't have anything additionally to add.
Well, it just made me think of PFLAG, my parents and friends of lesbians and gays. They're an educationally oriented organization, and I know that I would imagine that if this person was looking for examples, they might touch on their local PFLAG people and see whether or not something like that could be found as well. Will being queer get in the way of academic success? What do you think?
I think that depends on the discipline to some extent. We have probably some areas where if you were not LGBTQ identified, it might even be a challenge. We've heard that, for example, in some of the, again, gender and sexuality studies work. Perhaps it would be challenging if you were not part of that community. I don't know for sure. I haven't been on the job market in that particular field. I think it would be interesting to, again, working with some of the communities on Twitter and other places. I'm hearing conversations, for example, 500 queer scientists, 500 women scientists. These kinds of platforms are being very helpful for people to navigate where places are that would be friendly or not so friendly for them as they pursue their careers.
One thing that I will just add that we haven't really touched on a whole lot is individuals who are gender fluid or who are transgender. And so I can say being queer did not get in the way of my academic success, but I also am cisgender. I am white American. I have these other identities that have privileged me in ways that I know not everyone in the community has. I have a friend who is on the job market who is gender fluid, and they talk about the struggles of going to interview, that oftentimes, well, first of all, they don't always get to the next round of the interview process, likely because of the scholarship that they do working with trans individuals. Additionally, Google is alive and well, and it's likely that candidates are Googled and then the image is presented, and that may then deter from moving further. Then they get to the job interview, and there has been nothing set up in terms of bathrooms that they're able to use. And then the candidate has to ask, and it's this very odd conversation. And so there's a number of experiences that they're having just being on the job interview that is really, really frustrating. And so it's really easy for me to say, no, of course not. It's not going to get in your way. But that's my lived experience. And I know that there are many struggles and obstacles other people in our community are having in terms of academic success. And so we have to be cognizant of those. And again, we are a very limited panel. I mean, as Carrie and I have been talking, we have some similar experiences. And so we don't have the diversity of how other academics are experiencing this identity. And it would be very, very short-sighted for at least for me to say, yes, you can be academically successful, but there's probably things that really add up over time that make it very challenging for some of us to be successful.
And I just want to bring gender into that. We are all women, and traditionally research has pointed out that men have a much more difficult time than women do when it comes to the situations that could go either way. Women's sexuality can be kind of overlooked or put into some other category in people's heads, and sometimes men are in a position where it can be much more harmful. So
on an uplifting note, I would like to say that certainly when I chair, as I said, the National Diversity and Inclusion Committee for the Council of Graduate Schools, we talk as deans about diversity and inclusion constantly. It's almost the number one, outside of perhaps mental health for graduate students and finances, that those are sort of the top three things that we talk about all the time. There is a very, very deep-rooted interest on the part of the deans to having higher ed access for a broad, for all of our communities. And we are working hard on making sure that the search committees for various positions are educated around implicit bias and to understand what it means to be inclusive, to include a variety of places to put your job postings and so forth, to draw a broad and diverse background in terms of your pool. So I would argue that there is also really, really good news out there in that regard. We have just created here at UNH it's like a postdoctoral fellowship for diverse populations to come to UNH, and there will be 5 openings there this year. The goal here would be to draw some people in who might then also be interested in checking us out over a longer period of time. And then if an opening were to occur, they would maybe be in a position to stay. And we are putting these in areas where we anticipate openings will occur. So this is a very deliberate act on our part to try to draw a diverse population. So I would suggest that looking out for those kinds of things, they're signals from the institutional standpoint to you as potential employees to say, we are looking for diversity in all its forms.
And those kinds of signals show up in a number of ways. Someone who regularly goes on university websites looking for all kinds of things. You can put in keywords and blogs that might have been written, or a president's address that use those keywords, or a number of signals will come up from that too. So there's some good ways in. I just want to point out, because we're getting to the end of our time, that in your handouts are the slides from today. This particular slide from Dr. Moorhead was the safe zones that she mentioned, is at the top, and then the number of other things that go on. Carrie, tell us about the Kidder Awards.
What I mentioned was back in the early 90s. This is hopefully a not so long version of this, but I heard about that history from the early 70s. And at the time, the students were trying to get recognized. The governor refused to meet with them, and there was talk that the governor was going to cancel the entire budget for the university system of New Hampshire if they let the gay kids go, which, I mean, really, it was a big deal at the time. And so the students were trying to talk to the governor, and he was not wanting to meet with them. And the public television station had a fundraiser, as they do regularly now. This was the first one, and they were going to offer a pancake breakfast with the governor. And they got $2,000 together in 1972, if you can believe it. That's a huge amount of money. And they bid on the breakfast, and they found out it was the gay kids who were bidding on the breakfast, and they yanked the breakfast, and the governor didn't meet with them. And so 20 years later, I hear this story, and I decided, look, we should throw our own breakfast. Right? We shouldn't be waiting around for someone to say no. We just threw a breakfast, invited anyone who was LGBT friendly to it. And now it's become 25 years on, the award ceremony every year. It is a pancake breakfast in their honor. The president is there, all of the coaches. It's a big deal. The provost gives us, the deans, a waiver of going to our provost staff meetings so that we can all be there as a very visible support to the community. And the Kidder Awards were, in the very first year, I said, well, we should make up prizes and give ourselves prizes because nobody else will. So we will do that, and in honor of the work, because as you know, this work can be hard. It's a long haul. So every year we want to stop and smell the roses and say, yay, we chipped away and we did this work, but there's more to be done, and celebrate. So this gentleman at the time, Bill Kidder, then passed away in that first year. And he had been the former Dean of Men at the time. And he was also somebody who had unfortunately passed away due to HIV and AIDS. And so he, in his will, had left some funds. And now the awards are presented out of that fund every year in his honor.
A great story to kind of wrap this up with, that, because what it tells me is that digging in and doing things and keeping going, the effect over time can be very positive and can build a whole new environment. And there are other resources, again, in your handout about the different, I noticed one here was, some of your, what are these, Carrie? You just sent them on. Accredited Schools Online. Oh, HRC is here. So other things you might check out, and we will have more. There will be an LGBTQ page on the oer.pd.education site, which is where we put up our open educational resources. And we will move on. And I just want to finish by saying, if you're here still, please go to that SurveyMonkey web experience. It's just 3 questions. We really do want to build up a credible amount of answers about how we're doing so we can better guide this ship to serve all people. And the very next session, which starts in 15 minutes, is about owning your own professional development plan and managing your own education within a set program, within a set university, within so many things. How do you guide yourself through that? So we'll start that in 15 minutes, right up the road in another one of these webinars. Let me thank the people our deans for being here, and the people still left in the room. It's an excellent start. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
And I will just end the webinar.